Okay, so hello class, welcome back. So in this recording, we're going to talk about section 1.5, which is the bias that we have in the sampling. So we're going to take a look at the resources that we might have it based on the bias. Yeah, so what is the source of the bias? Yeah, so if the results of the sample are not representatives of the population, then the sample has some kinds of bias. So there are three sources of the bias that we have. So what are they? So let's talk about the first source of the bias. So the first source of bias that we might have gonna be the sampling bias or sampling bias. So what does it mean by the sampling bias? So sampling bias means that the technique used to obtain the individual to be in the sample tend to favor one part of the population over another. So which means that the technique or the method that we use it to select the individual to be included in the sample have some kinds of bias. So if you can remember the different technique that we learned from the previous section, 1.3 and 1.4, we mentioned about simple random sample. We talk about stratify, we talk about systematic, we talk about clusters. And one of the technique we also mentioned is convenience, right? So convenient methods is easier to access the data, but the results is not reliable. Yeah. So convenient sample automatically have this kinds of bias because the individuals are not chosen using the random samples. Undercovered is another type of sampling bias. So undercoverage, which means that when the proportion of one segment of the population is lower in the sample than it is in the population or left out completely. So that's going to be the first source of the bias, which is sampling bias. So we're going to move on and talk about the second source of the bias, which is the response bias. Okay. So what's it going to be? The non-response bias, actually. Yeah. Okay. Okay, so the next sources of bias that we have is going to be non-response bias. So non-response bias. Okay, so what is the definition of non-response bias? So non-response bias exists when individuals selected to be in the sample who do not respond to the survey have different opinion from those who do. So which means that the people that you haven't included them in the sample have different opinion than the one that you have included in the sample. That's going to be non-response bias. So in order to overcome this non-response bias, we can use the callback or the rewards or the incentive. Yeah. So non-response bias can be improved by using a callback or rewards or incentives. Yeah. So this is the non-response bias. So that's going to be the second source of bias. Now we're going to talk about the third one, which is another kind of bias we might have, which is the response bias. Okay. So response bias, what does it mean by the response bias? Okay. So we're gonna have this kinds of bias when the answers on a survey who do not reflect the true feelings of the respondent. So which means that when you ask some kinds of question, it's kind of a little bit personal, look like, oh, how heavy you are, how many push-ups that you can do in 1 minute or something like that. So maybe the answer that it might not the true representative from the individuals. Yeah. So the types of response bias might be interviews errors, misrepresented answer, the wording that used in the survey question, the order of the question, or the wording used in the question. Yeah. So for example, instead of asking directly how on are some people going to be, right, or how heavy or what's going to be the weight of some person, you might give them the option, the scale to select it. Maybe it's going to be less than 150 pounds, more than 150 pounds. So we just reward in the question to avoid the response bias. Yeah. So that's going to be the response bias. So now we're going to talk about the error that we have it from the sample. Yeah. So we have the two error that we might have it, which is sampling error and non-sampling error. Yeah. So let's talk about the first error that we might have. Okay. So what's a non-sampling error? So non-sampling errors are the error that result from the sampling bias, non-response bias, response bias, or data entries error. Such errors could also be presented in a complete census of the population. Here we might have a good representative sample of the population, so there's no error with the sampling method, but the process of collecting the data, yeah. So the non-sampling errors is come from the sampling bias that we have, non-response bias, or data entry. So that's going to be non-sampling error. So we have another kind of error that we might have is the sampling error. So sampling errors is the error that result from using the sample to estimate information about the population. Yeah. So these types of errors occur because of the sample give you incomplete information about the population. Yeah. So when you're using the sample to estimate the population and the samples is not a complete information of the population or not a true representatives of the population, that's why we're gonna get the sampling error. Yeah. So for this section 1.5, we just talk about different sources of bias and the different kinds of error that we might have it from when we're doing statistics. Yeah. So this is going to be the conclusion of section 1.5. So I will stop the sharing at this point, and I will end the recording at this point also. I will see you next time for section 1.6. Yeah.